The night was alive with the howl of a cruel ice storm, and the land was buried under endless snow and shards of frozen wind. And in that merciless storm, a mother stumbled forward with her small child pressed against her chest, and the child was weak and trembling as the storm bit into their thin clothes and the mother's arms were numb. But she held on because to let go would mean death, and she had been cast out by her people long ago, left with nothing but this child, and now even the sky itself seemed to want to finish them. She could not see more than a few steps ahead as the storm raged like a living beast, and her breath froze in the air before her lips and her eyes burned from the sharp sting of ice. But she did not stop, because stopping would mean never rising again, and the child whimpered softly, the sound nearly stolen by the screaming wind, and the mother whispered words of comfort, though her own voice shook and broke, as if even her spirit might give way. Land was empty and cruel, and the storm was endless, and her legs buckled with every step. Yet she forced herself forward because some part of her heart still clung to the tiny chance of life for the little one. And she thought of the faces of her people who had turned away from her cold and without pity. And she thought of the day she was cast out when no hand reached for her. No voice called her name and no eyes showed compassion. And so she walked alone through the storm, carrying the only soul who still looked at her with trust. Her vision blurred as the storm thickened, and she thought she saw shapes moving in the haze. But she shook her head, for surely it was only the madness of exhaustion and frost. And then she slipped and fell, to her knees, the snow rising up around her like waves of a frozen sea. And the child cried weakly as the cold bit deeper into their small body, and the mother felt despair sink into her chest, like a heavy stone pulling her spirit down. The storm roared louder as if mocking her weakness, and she whispered to her child that it would be all right, even though her heart told her otherwise. And she tried to rise, but her legs trembled and would not lift her, and she pressed her face against the child's hair and prayed silently for mercy, though she knew none would come from the sky above or the earth below, and she thought this was the end. But then through the blinding snow came the sound of heavy steps crunching against the ice, and her eyes widened in disbelief as a shadow emerged, tall and broad, moving with strength against the storm as if defying it with every stride. And she blinked against the frozen wind, trying to believe it was real and not another cruel vision of the storm. The figure came closer, and she saw it was not one of her people but a human, and his face was hardened by the storm, yet his eyes burned with life and will, and his heavy coat was crusted with ice. But still he pressed forward, and when he reached her, he knelt in the snow beside her, shielding her and the child with his body as the storm clawed at them. She looked at him in shock, her lips too frozen to speak and her mind unable to understand, for no one had ever shown her kindness since the day she was abandoned, and yet here was a stranger lowering himself into the snow and sharing his strength and warmth with a woman who was nothing in the eyes of her own kind. And he looked at her child, then at her, and his voice rose firm against the storm, saying, "You cannot stop here, you must hold on." The mother trembled between fear and hope, and her eyes filled with tears that froze upon her cheeks, because in that moment she felt something she had never known before, and it was compassion. The storm screamed over the land like a wild beast, and snow tore through the air with sharp claws. But inside that frozen chaos, the human crouched low, shielding the mother and child with his broad frame, and his breath rose in white clouds as he leaned closer and said words that carried strength. Though the wind tried to steal them away, he said, "You cannot give up, not while this child still breathes." The mother stared at him, unable to answer, for her lips were numb and her body nearly frozen, and she wondered why he was here, why he would risk his life for a stranger cast out by her own kind. And the child whimpered against her chest, and the man shifted closer, pulling off his heavy cloak and wrapping it around both of them, though it left him bare to the cruel bite of the storm. And she shook her head weakly, not understanding how anyone could show such compassion. He lifted the child gently from her arms, cradling the small form against his chest, and his eyes narrowed against the wind as if daring the storm to stop him, and he said, "We must move now or the cold will claim us all." And with those words he rose, pulling the mother to her feet, though she staggered and nearly fell. But his strong grip steadied her, and together they pressed forward into the white abyss. Each step was a battle as snow reached up to their knees and the wind shoved them back with invisible hands. But the man moved with steady determination, and the mother stumbled behind, clutching his coat for support. And she saw the blood on his knuckles where the ice had torn his skin, Yet he did not falter, and his arms shielded the child, as though nothing else in the world mattered more than that fragile life. The mother's thoughts whirled like the storm around her, and she remembered every cold glance, every cruel word, every moment of rejection from her own people. And she could not understand how this human who owed her nothing would give his warmth, his strength, and perhaps even his life for her child and for her, and fear tangled with hope in her chest until she could hardly breathe. The storm howled louder as the ground beneath them shifted, and the crunch of their steps gave way to a hollow sound, and the man froze, his sharp gaze sweeping the ground, and then he cursed under his breath, for they had wandered onto the frozen river, and the ice beneath their feet groaned like a dying beast, and cracks laced across the surface, spreading out like dark veins in the pale sheety. Mother gasped, clutching at his arm, and the child whimpered as the ice beneath them shuddered, and the man's face hardened with grim resolve as he whispered, "Do not panic. Do not move too fast." And he shifted the child higher into his arms, tightening his grip until his knuckles whitened, and he guided the mother carefully across the fragile surface. Each step was agony as the ice groaned louder and water surged below, dark and cold and waiting, and the storm seemed to laugh at them with each gust. And the mother's heart pounded in her ears louder than the wind, and she felt her legs weaken with terror. But the man's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding, saying, "Look at me, not at the ice, just look at me." His eyes burned with a fire that the storm could not quench, and for the first time in her life she obeyed without question, staring only at him as he moved forward one step, then another, and still the ice cracked and split beneath their feet, and the river raged below, hungry for their fall. The mother's breath caught as a sharp crack split the night louder than thunder, and the ice buckled beneath them, tilting like a broken plate, and the child gave a cry that pierced the storm, and the man shouted, "Hold on," and in that instant the world seemed to collapse around them as the frozen surface gave way under their weight, and they were thrown into the jaws of the icy river. The river roared like a monster awakened from its sleep, and the shattered ice pulled them down with cruel hands, and the mother screamed as the child slipped from her arms. But before the frozen water could swallow the little one, the human lunged with fierce strength, catching the child against his chest and holding on though the icy current clawed at him. The storm above shrieked as if celebrating its victory, and the river below churned black and merciless. Yet the man fought with desperate power, slamming his bleeding hands against the jagged edge of the broken ice until he found grip, and his muscles strained as he tried to lift himself and the child and the mother who clung to him with trembling hands. The cold was like knives cutting into their flesh, and every breath burned like fire in their lungs, and the mother thought surely this was the end yet. When she looked into the human's face, she saw not surrender but fierce determination, and his eyes blazed with a strength she had never seen in any being, and it gave her a fragile thread of hope. The ice cracked, further spreading outward as if eager to claim them, and the man gritted his teeth, pulling the mother upward with one arm while holding the child tight against his chest with the other, and his breath came ragged, but he refused to yield, and he shouted over the storm, telling her, "Climb up, do not let go." And his voice struck her like a command that could not be denied. With shaking arms, she dragged herself onto the broken sheet of ice, crawling like a wounded creature, and she turned, reaching for him as he hung halfway in the water, his body shivering violently. Yet his eyes never wavered from hers, and he thrust the child toward her, pushing with all his strength until the little one slid into her embrace, and she held the child close, sobbing with relief, though the danger was far from over. The man clung to the edge, his skin turning blue and his hands torn raw, yet he heaved himself upward with a final surge of will, and the ice groaned under his weight, but did not break. And he rolled onto the surface, gasping as the storm howled around them, and the mother stared at him in disbelief, for she could not understand how anyone could fight the river itself and survive. Snow whipped across their faces, and the world was nothing but white and gray, and the storm seemed endless, but now they were together on the fragile ice, and the man rose to his knees, still clutching the child with steady hands, and he looked at the mother and said, "We must move again. This place will not hold," and his voice, though ragged, carried the weight of unbroken resolve. She nodded, though her body trembled from cold and fear, and she followed, as he crawled carefully across the cracking surface, his eyes scanning for any solid ground, and every moment the ice groaned louder and water surged below. threatening to swallow them whole, and the mother's heart pounded with terror. Yet she placed her trust in him because he had already given everything to save them. The child whimpered softly, their small bodies shivering against her chest, and the man reached back, steadying her when she faltered, and his touch was firm and strong, and it anchored her to life in a way she had never known before, and she whispered words of thanks, though her voice was nearly lost to the storm. At last they reached the far side of the river where the ground rose higher, and the man hauled both her and the child onto the snow-covered bank, and he collapsed for a moment, his chest heaving and his breath coming in ragged clouds, but still his arms remained tight around the child as if even in exhaustion he would never let go. The mother knelt beside him, tears freezing on her cheeks, and she whispered, "Why do you fight so hard for us?" And her voice cracked with disbelief and wonder, and he turned his head, his eyes still fierce though his body shook from the cold, and he said, "Because no one else would," and his words pierced her heart deeper than the storm ever could. The wind screamed louder, and the snow thickened once more as if the storm had not finished its cruelty, and the mother realized their struggle was far from over, and she looked at the man who now carried the burden of 3 lives on his shoulders, and she knew that the ice had not only broken beneath them, but something inside her had broken too. The wall that had kept out hope and compassion. And now she could no longer deny that this human was different. The storm did not rest it, raged above them with endless fury, and the wind cut like blades through their skin. Yet the human forced himself to stand again, carrying the child close against his chest, and offering his hand to the mother, pulling her forward as if his strength alone could guide them through the frozen night. And the mother stumbled beside him, her legs heavy like stone, but she clung to him because without him she knew the storm would claim them both. The snow grew deeper with every step, and the world around them was nothing but shifting white shadows, and the mother felt her hope slipping like sand between her fingers. Yet the man never slowed. He pressed forward with stubborn will, his breath ragged, his eyes fierce, and each time she faltered, he steadied her as though her life mattered as much as the child in his arms, and this thought pierced her heart with strange warmth that the cold could not kill. They wandered for what felt like hours, though time was broken by the storm, and finally the man's eyes caught a dark shape half buried in snow, and he dragged them toward it with desperate energy. And when they reached it, she saw the remains of an outpost wall's broken roof, shattered, but still standing against the storm, and the man pushed open the crooked door and pulled them inside. The silence struck her ears like a blessing after the endless roar outside, and though the wind still slipped through cracks in the walls, the shelter gave them space to breathe, and the man laid the child gently down on the frozen floor before searching the ruined interior with urgent movements, his hands scraping through debris until he found scraps of wood and broken crates, and with trembling fingers he pulled a small device from his pack, a spark tool, and he struck it until a tiny flame leapt to life. The mother watched with wide eyes as he fed the flame with wood and scraps until fire grew strong and warm, spreading light through the dark space, and the storm outside howled against the walls. But inside, the orange glow pushed back the shadows, and for the first time she felt a fragile sense of safety, though she did not know if it could last. The child stirred in the warmth, pressing closer to the mother's arms, and she stroked the small face with trembling fingers, whispering words of comfort. And she looked at the man as he crouched near the fire, his shoulders shaking from exhaustion and cold, yet his eyes still sharp as if refusing to yield, and she felt a deep confusion rise within her, for never had she seen such will in anyone, not even among her own kind. The man finally sat beside the fire and looked at her, and his voice, though rough, was steady when he said, "The storm will not last forever, but you must stay close to the heat, and you must not give up again." And his gaze pierced her like an arrow striking deep, because she knew he had seen her despair on the river, and he had dragged her back from it with his own strength. She lowered her head, her voice breaking, as she whispered, "I do not understand why you saved us." And her hands clutched the child tighter as if afraid that his answer might slip away like everything else she had lost, and the fire crackled, filling the silence with gentle sound, and the man stared into the flames for a long moment before turning his eyes back to hers, and in their glow she saw no judgment, no cruelty, only simple truth. "Because no one else would." He said his words soft yet heavy as stone, and her chest tightened as if the weight of his compassion was too much to bear, and tears welled in her eyes, freezing against her cheeks. But she did not hide them because for the first time she felt they carried no shame, only release. The storm outside raged, louder battering the outpost walls as if enraged by their fragile hope, and the mother felt both fear and wonder as she sat beside the man and the child, safe for now in the glow of the fire. And she realized that survival was not the only thing the storm had given her. It had also brought a stranger who burned brighter than the cold could ever extinguish. The fire crackled in the broken outpost, its orange glow pushing shadows away, while the storm screamed beyond the shattered walls, and inside the small shelter, the mother held her child close, feeling the warmth seep slowly into frozen skin, and her eyes rested on the human who sat across from her. His face lit by firelight, his coat torn, his hands raw and bleeding, yet his posture still steady, as if he carried the weight of both their lives without hesitation. The mother's heart twisted with confusion, for never before had she witnessed such strength mixed with kindness, and she remembered the faces of her people when they had turned her away, their eyes filled with scorn, their voices cold with judgment, and now in front of her sat a stranger who had no reason to help, no duty, no bond, yet he risked everything to protect her child. And she whispered again, her voice low and trembling, "Why do you fight for us? Why not leave us to the storm like everyone else did?" The man turned his gaze from the flames to her, his eyes calm yet fierce, and he spoke with quiet certainty because no one else would. And his words struck her deeper than any blade because they were not wrapped in grand speeches or empty promises. They were simple and true, and she felt her breath catch, as though those words had unlocked something within her that had been sealed by years of pain. The child stirred in her arms, and she smoothed the small hair with gentle fingers, and she wondered if perhaps compassion was not weakness, as her people had claimed, but strength. And she studied the man again, seeing how exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, yet his eyes never closed to the danger around them, and she realized that even wounded and weary he would rise again if the storm demanded it. The hours dragged slowly, and the fire consumed the scraps of wood crackling bravely against the cold, and the mother dared to ask him his name, though her voice shook with shyness, and he answered with a single word, a name simple yet strong, and she repeated it under her breath as if it carried warmth of its own, and she gave her name softly in return. And for the first time since her exile, she felt as though she was seen not as a burden, not as an outcast, but as someone who mattered. Silence filled the shelter again, broken only by the howl of wind and the pop of burning wood. And in that silence, her thoughts turned heavy, and she feared the storm might last forever, that the fire would die and the cold would claim them. Yet when she looked at the human and saw his steady gaze, she felt a fragile thread of hope hold her together, and she clung to it because it was all she had. The child coughed softly, and the man leaned closer, checking the small form with careful hands, his touch gentle, though his fingers were rough with cuts and scars, and he said, "The little one is weak, but strong enough to hold on, if we keep them warm and fed," and his voice carried confidence that made her believe his words even against the storm. And she whispered, "Thank you," though the words felt too small for what he had given. The firelight danced across their faces as time passed, and fatigue tugged at her eyes, but she dared not sleep, afraid the storm would creep in and steal the fragile safety they had found. Yet the man noticed her struggle and told her, "Rest for a while. I will keep watch." And though every part of her wanted to resist, she felt her body yielding, and she leaned against the wall with the child secure in her arms, letting the warmth of fire and the steady presence of the man lull her toward a shallow, fragile rest. But before sleep claimed her, ears caught a sound that was not the storm. It was heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching against the snow outside, and her eyes flew open wide with fear. And she looked at the man who had already risen to his feet, his body tense, his hand gripping a broken piece of wood as a weapon, his gaze locked on the door where shadows moved beyond the cracks. The storm was not their only enemy. Something else had come searching through. The night and the fragile safety of the outpost was about to shatter. The door rattled as the footsteps grew louder outside, and the storm howled as if it carried the intruders forward, and the mother clutched her child tighter, pressing close to the wall, her heart racing with fear while the human stood tall, his body tense like a bowstring, his hand gripping the broken wood as if it were a blade forged for battle. The door burst inward with a violent crack, and snow blasted into the shelter, and figures stormed inside wrapped in ragged furs, their eyes gleaming with hunger and cruelty. And they were raiders, hunters of the desperate who searched storms for the weak and the lost, and their laughter cut through the wind like knives as they spotted the mother and the child huddled in the firelight. The leader, a tall brute with scars down his face, sneered and pointed his crude weapon toward the mother, saying, "The child will fetch good price. The woman will serve us well," and his voice was harsh and cold like the storm outside, and the mother cried out, pulling her child closer, trembling as memories of exile and cruelty filled her mind, and she felt despair rising again. But before it could consume her, the human stepped between them and the raiders, his shoulders broad, his stance unbroken, his eyes burning with defiance. The leader laughed, mocking the lone defender, and his men moved forward, weapons raised, but the human struck first, lunging with sudden fury, his makeshift club crashing into the nearest raider's face, sending him sprawling across the frozen floor, and the others snarled, rushing him from all sides. But he moved like fire, swift and unyielding, striking with raw strength, fueled not by rage alone, but by the unshakable will to protect. The mother watched with wide, terrified eyes as the shelter filled with chaos, wood clashing against steel, shouts mingling with the storm, and sparks of fire scattering as the struggle overturned burning logs across the floor, and the child whimpered in her arms, and she pressed close against the wall, praying the man's strength would be enough against so many. Blood splattered across the snow-covered floor as the human fought with relentless force, each blow heavy, each movement filled with desperation and courage, and the raiders cursed and cried out as they fell one after another. Yet their numbers pressed hard against him, and wounds opened across his arms and shoulders, and crimson stained his torn coat, but still he refused to fall. The leader roared with fury and charged, swinging his heavy blade, but the human met him head on, their weapons clashing with a sound that shook the shelter, and the mother gasped as sparks lit the dark corner, and the fire roared higher, feeding on broken wood as if the flames themselves cheered the struggle, and the man's arms trembled, yet his eyes never wavered, his will unbroken even as the brute pressed him back. The mother's chest tightened with terror as the leader drove the human against the wall, the blade pressing close to his throat, and she wanted to scream, wanted to run forward, though she knew she was helpless, and tears froze on her cheeks. But then, with sudden strength, the man twisted, his body slamming his shoulder into the brute's chest, knocking him off balance, and with a roar, he drove his broken club across the raider's head, sending the leader crashing into the fire. The blaze consumed the raider's furs with a scream, and panic seized the remaining men, who stumbled back into the storm, dragging their wounded as they fled into the night, leaving only silence broken by the crackle of fire and the harsh sound of the human's breathing as he staggered forward, blood dripping from his wounds. The mother rushed to him, laying the child gently down and reaching for his torn arms, her hands trembling as she whispered, "You are hurt. You cannot fight alone again," and her voice cracked with fear and awe. And the man looked at her with weary eyes, still steady despite the pain, and he said, "I will always fight because you and your child are worth more than my life," and his words shattered the last wall around her heart. The storm outside howled louder, furious that its chosen prey had been saved once more. But inside the broken outpost, the fire burned stronger than before, and the mother realized that even in the darkest night, compassion had lit a flame that no storm could snuff out. The storm raged through the long night, its voice a chorus of fury that battered the broken outpost, yet inside the fire burned steady and bright, casting its glow over the mother, the child, and the human who now sat wounded and weary, his body marked by blood and bruises, but his spirit unbroken, and the mother tended his injuries with shaking hands, using strips torn from her own clothes to bind the cuts. And she whispered soft words, though she feared they were too small to match the weight of what he had given. The child slept peacefully for the first time in days, wrapped in warmth beside the fire, and the mother's heart tightened as she looked at the human, and wondered how such strength could be born from compassion alone, for her people had told her compassion was weakness, had told her survival required cruelty. And yet here was a man who had fought storm and river and raiders not for himself but for her and her child, and he had not faltered. She sat close beside him, her eyes searching his face as the firelight danced across his features, and she said softly, I do not understand. You should not care for us yet. You risked your life again and again," and her voice trembled with both gratitude and disbelief. And he looked at her with calm eyes, though. Pain shadowed them, and he answered with simple truth, because every life matters and no one should be left to die alone. And his words filled her chest with warmth stronger than any fire. The storm began to weaken its howl, fading to a dull whisper, and through the cracks in the walls, pale light touched the snow outside, and the mother knew dawn had come, and with it a chance to leave the broken outpost behind. And she turned to the human, her voice quiet yet firm, saying, "We cannot stay here. We must move." And he nodded. Though his wounds ached and his body longed for rest, for his will remained strong, and he lifted himself to his feet, steadying the child in his arms as though the pain did not exist. Together they stepped into the frozen world once more, the wind softer now, the snow glittering beneath the first light of day, and the storm clouds parted enough to reveal the sky streaked with silver and pale gold. And the sight stole the breath from the mother, for she had thought she would never live to see another dawn. And she whispered a prayer of thanks, though she did not know to whom. The path ahead was long and the snow deep, but the human walked with firm steps, carrying the child and guiding the mother beside him, and she felt strength in his presence, as if his spirit lent her the will to move forward. And with each step the weight of exile and despair lifted from her shoulders piece by piece, until she could breathe again, without fear, choking her. Hours passed, and the sun rose higher, and they reached a ridge that overlooked the valley below, where trees stood tall, their branches heavy with frost and smoke, curled faintly from the chimneys of a settlement hidden among them. And the mother's heart leapt. With hope for the first time in her life, she saw a place where safety might be found, and she turned to the human, her eyes shining with tears and wonder. He studied the valley with sharp gaze, his face calm yet thoughtful. And then he looked at her and said, "We will find a new beginning there, but only if you are ready to believe you deserve it." And his words pierced her deeper than the cold, and she felt her knees weaken as she clutched the child close, and for the first time she dared to believe that she and her child were worthy of life and love. They descended into the valley together, their figures small against the vast snow-covered land. Yet the fire of their survival burned bright and unyielding within them. And as the village came closer, the mother looked at the man who had given her hope and whispered, "You saved more than our lives, you saved my heart." And her voice carried truth that could never be broken by storm or steel. The dawn spread wider across the sky, banishing the last shadow of the storm, and the world was no longer just cold and cruel. It was filled with light and promise, and though the road ahead would be hard, she knew she would never face it alone, for the human who had stood between her and death now walked beside her into a new life.